Welcome everyone to session P19 on the LC implications of dementia research and AI. My name is Angela Bradshaw. I'm a project officer at Alzheimer Europe, and I work with the Virtual Brain Cloud project. So the goal of Virtual Brain Cloud is to create a decision support system for clinicians using a cloud platform for personalized brain simulation. And what that means is the project is trying to develop a structure for doctors to more easily diagnose and potentially treat individuals who are presenting in clinic with symptoms of what could be Alzheimer's disease or dementia. The way they're aiming to do this is to bring together lots of different sources of data. These are big data sets which might come from brain scans such as EEG and PET and MRI. They are also genetic data sets which come from a readout of your genetic code and might give clues as to your risk or your personal parameters around whether you are likely or not likely to develop these conditions. Because of the use of personal data, and particularly the use of sensitive personal data, because these are health data sets, there are quite a number of ethical, legal, and social implications of this type of research, which involve the use of artificial intelligence. So in this session, we're going to explore how some of these issues arise and how they can be addressed, and how we can guarantee that sensitive patient data is used by AI systems in an ethical, socially responsible and transparent way. And to do that, we have invited three excellent speakers to talk to you about this topic. We have, first of all, Professor Bernd STAHL, who is the Director of the Centre for Computing and Social Responsibility at Montfort University, Leicester. He's currently serving as the Ethics Director of the EU FET flagship Human Brain Project, which you may have heard of. This is a over €1 billion initiative, which will last for another 4 years, I believe, and brings together a vast number of researchers across Europe working on many different brain science disciplines. And there is a very important ethical component to this, which Bernd leads. Bernd will kick off our session with a pre-recorded presentation. I would like to invite the Zoom moderator to launch this video, and Bernd will be available at the end of the session to answer any questions.
Hello, my name is Bernd STAHL. I'd like to welcome you to this presentation on responsible artificial intelligence, the implications for brain research. I am a professor at Montfort University in Leicester in the UK, where I lead a research group called the Centre for Computing and Social Responsibility. So we do research around ethical and social aspects of ICT, and these days, of course, there's a heavy emphasis on artificial intelligence. Among the various projects that we're running is the Human Brain Project, where my team is responsible for various aspects of responsible innovation and ethics compliance. So a lot of the work I'm presenting here is inspired by this, but it draws more heavily on another project, which is the Sherpa project. Sherpa, as you can see on the first slide, stands for Shaping the Ethical Dimensions of Information Technologies, a European Perspective. So what I will do in this presentation is I'll briefly explain some of the benefits of AI in brain research. I will then explain what the Sherpa project has done. From there, we'll look at various ways of understanding artificial intelligence as well as ethical issues that can arise. And we'll look at the broader landscape of what is currently being discussed as ways of dealing with possible ethical issues coming from these technologies. And I will end with a brief overview of some of the activities that may be required or may be helpful in addressing various ethical issues with a specific emphasis on brain research. So let's start with the benefits. So what is it that artificial intelligence can bring to brain research? What are the scientific and to a large extent also the ethical benefits? So I think more generally, or in a general term, you could say that artificial intelligence can help undertake brain research in many different ways. And one of the examples of that would be that it can be used to analyze large amounts of data for classification of diseases. So to better understand what is the cause, what are cause-effect relationships within the brain that explain diseases. if that works, of course, it can also lead to better treatments, to ways of dealing with these diseases, which at some point can then also lead into clinical support. So it may help doctors in their day-to-day work better deal with understanding what the diseases a patient displays and what can be done about them. And ideally, this may also lead to the point where we have personalized treatment, where your specific disease as a sufferer of a brain disease can be understood very specifically to the point where it can be treated very specifically. So these are some of the examples, and I think that there's a lot more out there, but some of the prominent examples of benefits of AI in brain research. Before I go back to this, I'll briefly outline what the Sherpa project has done. So Sherpa is not confined to brain research, but looks at artificial intelligence and big data, what we call smart information systems, or SIS, across a variety of areas. So the first challenge we had is understanding what are the ethical and what are the human rights implications of these technologies. And we did the activities you can see here. So we did a set of case studies, we did scenarios, we looked at the cybersecurity aspect of it, we looked at ethical and human rights from a literature perspective. So on the basis of our empirical understanding, we still need to understand what broader social perceptions are, and we therefore have done a number of things to ensure that we have stakeholder input. So we run a stakeholder board with about 30 members. We've done interviews with a number of experts. We've done an online survey, and we are still finalizing a Delphi study with experts on ethical issues and human rights aspects of AI and big data. On the basis of this understanding of what the issues are, we are developing what we call a workbook, which is basically a portfolio of possible activities that can be undertaken to address these issues. And we focus on the ones that you see here. So we've developed a set of guidelines for researchers and for users of smart information systems. We've looked at regulatory options. We are working with standardization organizations. We are looking at technical options, in particular with regards to security interventions, and we are writing or exploring in terms of reference for a possible regulator. Now, developing these ideas only goes some way, and we need to understand whether they're feasible, whether stakeholders are able to implement them. We therefore have done a number of activities around validating our solutions. Most of those, or the focus of those, was a set of focus groups that we undertook with stakeholder groups across Europe to find out whether people can deal with these solutions, whether they can implement what we've proposed. And then finally, we're working on implementation. So we're trying to now move the work in the Sherpa project into the decision space. So we're working with policymakers, we're working with decision makers, with companies, and we're doing all the normal things that you would expect from a European project. We disseminate, we communicate, write papers, we write policy briefs. But we also have thought about other ways of exploring or transmitting our messages. So we have an artistic representation. We've developed a set of videos, animated videos that show aspects of our work, and we have an artist in residence who tries to find alternative ways of representing what we've done. And finally, we have an advocacy arm. So we are actually planning to specifically reach out to policymakers once we have finalized our recommendations. By the way, we are now about two and a bit years into the project, and we have roughly a year left. So we have undertaken most of the work you've seen there, and we're now in the process of disseminating this more broadly. So back to the content. What do we mean by artificial intelligence? And that's a non-trivial question. There are many different definitions out there, and the field of artificial intelligence covers a lot of techniques, of technologies, of ways to manipulate data and interact with the world. That is in some way similar to what intelligence organisms do, such as humans, but not necessarily humans, other animals as well. Now, what you see here is an attempt to categorize the technologies that you can come across when you look at ethical and human rights aspects. So I distinguish three main groups here, which you see, that's machine learning, converging socio-technical systems, and general AI. So machine learning is the probably most prominent aspect of artificial intelligence at this point. That is in itself a family of technologies. There are different ways of implementing machine learning, but it is what is often called narrow AI. So it is very good at doing very specific tasks, but it does not scale beyond those tasks, and it is a specific activity which you can use, for example, for classification of images, which is something that you could use in brain research. Now, machine learning has certain characteristics, in particular the type of machine learning that has been the driver behind the current success and visibility of AI. It tends to use large amounts of data. It uses things like neural networks, and these are difficult to understand. So translating what they do in human language is difficult, if not impossible. They require large amounts of input data, training data, and test data. And because they are learning systems, they also change their states during the course of their work, and therefore they are unpredictable in the sense that the same system in the same situation at two different places in time may react differently. So that's the probably most prominent aspect of AI. But if you go to the bottom of this slide, you see the converging socio-technical systems, as I've called them. So these are systems that have AI, typically machine learning, somewhere embedded in them, but they include a much broader view of interconnected systems that produce the data, that analyze the data, and then that act back into the world, and that also have direct implications for broader socio-technical systems. So these are this is a higher level view of these systems, which looks at questions of social impact, at how do people get manipulated, what are the consequences that can change our way of autonomy, of structuring the way people can act. And finally, we have what's called general AI. So this is the idea that we have artificial intelligence that has truly human capacities, which at this point does not exist, but which is something that has always been the aim of at least a part of the AI research community, and that raises a lot of specific ethical questions in its own right. Things like, what is human nature? How do we know about reality? What is it that makes humans unique? Some of these questions are also, of course, relevant to brain research. So if these are concepts of AI, then you can find ethical issues related to each of those specifically. So you have specific issues arising from machine learning, you have broader metaphysical questions coming from general AI, and you have social question about what does it mean to live in a digital world that are linked to those socio-technical systems. Examples of these, and now I come back to brain research, specific issues of machine learning could be things like unrepresentative data sets, which may lead to disease classifications which are not reproducible or not correct. So this is where you run a machine learning algorithm over, let's say, image data, but the image data in itself, so the data set is skewed because it only covers a certain subset of the population and therefore is not representative of other possible sufferers of the same disease. If you use large amounts of data, in particular large amounts of health data, then you have questions around data protection, security of the data, how do you make sure it's not misused? This is not specifically or not caused by AI, but it is linked to the fact that a lot of machine learning techniques require large data sets. And then you would have questions such as, does the system, if it has learned and leads to or facilitates automated diagnosis, can that lead to discrimination? Can a patient, for example, be misclassified or even classified correctly, but does that then lead to consequences which are not desirable, which are possibly foreseeable, but not addressed? So these are sort of specific questions arising out of machine learning. There are broader questions around what these technologies do to our world. And these are questions, for example, of justice of access to healthcare. So, as I said, that there are possible huge benefits, but the technologies are not necessarily cheap. So they may lead to further divides in the possibility of accessing high quality healthcare. There are issues, for example, with regards to how we treat populations. So if these technologies are successful in identifying, let's say, biomarkers of particular diseases, that might mean that certain people get stigmatized as being, for example, predisposed to a particular brain-related disease, which may disadvantage them, even though they may never suffer from the disease itself. And then there are questions such as who owns the data, who benefits from it, who has to pick up the risks, who has to pick up the costs. Often these are not the same. How do societies make these decisions, and how do they allocate risks and benefits? And then metaphysical questions, these are the questions relating to artificial general intelligence, which, as I said earlier, is something that is more of an aspiration, not an existing technology. But in our case here, with regards to the intersection between the brain and AI, I think that there are interesting metaphysical questions worth exploring, such as does our understanding of the brain change the way we view humans? Do we see ourselves as meat computers, and what does that mean with regards to how we treat human beings? There are also interesting technical questions, for example, the location of agency. So if we have AI supported interventions in the brain, for example, in deep brain stimulation, that raises interesting questions around, for example, where do we locate agency? So what if somebody who is being treated with deep brain stimulation commits a particular act, and then claims this was done because of the interaction between the AI, my brain, and my action. So I think this raises potentially difficult question as these technologies go forward and become more widespread. And there may be many others. So this is really just an overview of some of the key issues. So what can or should be done about this? And this is an attempt to summarize the main parts of the debate at the moment. So these are suggestions of ways of dealing with ethical and human rights issues of AI. And I've clustered this in policy level, organizational level, and guidance mechanism, with policy level being things like general national, international policies, legislation. Organizational are ways for companies or other organizations to integrate ethical awareness into their processes. And then we have guidance mechanisms which are geared towards specific individuals who are working as developers, as employers, as users of these technologies. I'm not going to go through these in any depth. The point here really is to show that there's a lot of discussion out there. So there are lots of suggestions of what can or should be done about ethical and human rights aspects of AI and big data. And who should do something about this? Well, this is an attempt to capture some of the main stakeholders. And you see there are many of them. From if you start with the higher level of abstraction, you start with international policymakers, you go through national governments, regional bodies, you have regulators, you have companies, you have researchers, research funders, and individuals in various different roles as users, as patients, as doctors. So there are many of those. The point here being that this is a very complex situation, and in order to make sense of this, we need to recognize that there is no simple solution, there is no magic bullet. But what is required is a mix of options. It's a way of dealing with various different ethical issues that arise in different contexts for different people. So one metaphor that has been suggested repeatedly is that of an ecosystem. So this is something that the European Commission has used, but many others as well. So seeing as AI as an ecosystem, and what does that mean for understanding AI and for thinking about the ethics? So here is an example of an ecosystem, and this ecosystem, in order to be ethically aware, should favor human flourishing. Now here's an example of what a specific aspect of a specific intervention might look like from an ecosystem's perspective. So we have the suggestion of creating an algorithmic impact assessment, and you see various stakeholders who are interlinked in various ways in order to make this happen. I think the metaphor of an ecosystem lends itself to certain to an analysis because it has certain characteristics. So ecosystems have boundaries that are difficult to determine. They have members that have constituents, components that co-evolve and learn from each other. Ecosystems are open, so they are their boundaries to the external environment are permeable in both directions. Evolution is an important driver, so they evolve over time. The actors within those systems are interdependent, but their relationships are difficult to predict. So they're not simple, there are complex relationships. And as a consequence, if you want to intervene in an ecosystem in order to propose or promote human flourishing, there are certain, what I would call here, challenges. So one challenge is what is the aim of the intervention, so what counts as human flourishing? How do we deal with the broad array of issues, of technologies? How do we deal with the dynamic and systemic relationship between the members of the ecosystem? What are ways of covering uncertainty? How do we define the boundaries of the ecosystem under investigation or under where action is to be taken? And then how do we deal with the interrelationship between the AI ecosystem or ecosystems in plural and their external environments? So I would suggest that the ecosystem metaphor is interesting because it suggests that there are three key aspects that need to be addressed. So there is, on the one hand, the drawing the boundaries, the delimitation of the ecosystem. Secondly, there's the knowledge base of the ecosystem in order to act ethically or allow its members to act in a way that is conducive to human flourishing, needs to have a knowledge base that covers technical, conceptual, procedural knowledge, but that also needs to be taught through some sort of capacity building. And then there have to be ecosystems governance aspects. So the governance needs to be adaptive, it needs to be flexible, and it needs to be able to learn. So what does that mean for brain research and the use of AI in brain research? Well, coming back to the very beginning, I think there are huge possible benefits, but there are also possible concerns. So the question is, how can we balance those? I think a key aspect here is the question of conceptual clarity. So what type of AI do we mean? What type of consequences are we interested in? And if you follow this idea of the ecosystem metaphor, then the question is, where does responsibility lie for the knowledge within this ecosystem? So if you see AI in brain research as a subsystem, as an ecosystem, so who is responsible for capturing the knowledge, who is responsible for disseminating good practice? And that then leads to questions of governance. And I think in particular in the healthcare system, there is a very interesting question of whether existing ways of dealing with technology, and of course healthcare has developed those extensively, whether they are sufficient or whether artificial intelligence raises new questions that go beyond what we already know about, and whether that requires new ways of developing governance. And I think with that, my time is up. I thank you for your attention, and I hope you enjoyed the presentation.
Great. Many thanks, Bernd, for that very excellent introduction to the topic of AI in research more generally, with some interesting reflections on AI and brain research specifically. Following on from Bernd, we have Michael CEPIC, who will be delivering his presentation live. So Michael CEPIC works at the University of Vienna in the Department for Innovation, I think it is, and he is a member of Professor Nicolas Forgeau's team, who are dealing with data protection aspects in the Virtual Brain Cloud project. Welcome, Michael. I'll hand over to you and I'll invite you to share your screen for your presentation.
Thank you, Angela. Can you see it?
Yep.
Okay.
All good.
Okay, great. So thank you for inviting me to speak at this amazing and fundamental conference. I was invited to speak about legal considerations for data protection in AI-driven research. And to point out the norms we will be dealing with, it's basically the General Data Protection Regulation that regulates the use of personal data. And for the sake of completeness, there is a separate law dealing with personal data used in law enforcement, but that's just to let you know. So I will use the BBC project or any project that deals with personal data as a sort of a methodology. And so when a project uses a data set, the first question we ask is what kind of data are involved? And it is only when personal data, as set out in Article 4.1, are being used that the GDPR is applicable. And then there are, of course, other categories, for example, non-personal data, health data. And so health data, that's the first point for a special category of data. And of course, in a research project in health research, most data are such data, so data concerning health. And to exemplify this, already if you say that how a person feels or his state is, and you say he or she is well, then that's describing the state of health. So that's already meriting higher protection. And of course, already at this point, we have questions, and we're at the moment trying to publish something about whether brain images are personal data. And that's, of course, a tricky situation because we can only solve this from a legal point, but you, of course, need scientific input. So that's an interdisciplinary issue. In any event, when it comes to AI, that's or in law in general, we need definitions, categorizations. And so when doing research, I was not able to find a very specific hard law definition of AI at the European level. So I tried to look up other soft law or reports and stuff like that. And what we see is that artificial intelligence is defined differently by these. And for example, the Commission says it's a system that displays intelligent behavior by analyzing, taking actions, and is in some way autonomous. And then another paper that's been published very recently says it's data, algorithms, computing power. And the European Data Protection Supervisor criticized this because they say it needs to be advanced in a way that it includes a decision-making model, algorithm. So what we see with all of that, and I tried to highlight this in bold, is that there are a couple of elements that I deem important for the definition. But that's just for the definition that we'll need later on. In any case, so once we've established the material scope, which are these personal data, the next step would be to identify the roles of the people involved that are sharing data. And so the question is if one of the project partners is controller or more are controllers and processors. And so a controller is a natural or legal person, a public authority, agency, or other body, which alone or jointly with others determines the purposes and means of the processing. And then the processor is the same, only he's acting on behalf. And these categorization is essential. And so what I was wondering for this presentation was who is the controller or processor? So who is the one responsible and who is the one who works on behalf when AI is being used? And so what we see in this display is that both of these the provisions mention the natural legal person, public authority, agency, and then other body. And so what I was in a way wondering is whether we can subsumize AI under other body. And there is a judgment which was rendered in the context of an authority, so it's not really AI, but I think it's still applicable. And it says that, or the court said, accordingly, the definition of the concept of a controller in the GDPR is not confined to public authorities, but is sufficiently wide to include anybody which, alone or jointly with others, determines the purposes and means of the processing. And so what we see here is that the court interprets this other body term extensively. And now the question that's remaining, of course, is what are we supposed to understand under that term, under anybody? And maybe an issue that needs to be taken into account here is that even if we use AI, that it still requires compliance with accountability. So some person has to be accountable for the processing that's taking place. And so maybe to reiterate this, the controller is the person that's responsible and that has the possibility to stop any processing at any time, and he really determines the means. And the processor is working on behalf. So my initial thought was, okay, AI might be able to be a processor. But if we look at the systematic perspective of the sentence, then we see there is a natural legal person, public authority, agency, and then comes other body. And in my view, this yields in a way that there must be some form of legal capacity. And as we speak, and at the moment, I don't think, and it's also the literature does not seem to be attributing legal capacity to AI. And so what this yields in the end is that we can understand AI only as an instrument. And for the definition then of artificial intelligence, either as a controller or a processor, I would say that they're neither. So they're just an instrument that's being used. And that's, of course, in the assessment of who is the controller or the processor, limits it again only to the project partners that are involved. So in the case of VBC, it would be maybe the one partner that's sharing a data set is the controller, and the one that's only processing it because the other one says, you process this please for this and this purpose, is a processor. And if he uses AI, it's still him who is or this partner who is the either controller or processor. And because this presentation with data protection issues could go in so many directions, I tried to use only the very specific provisions that might be interesting for the artificial intelligence. And another provision in this regard is Article 22, because there it says that the data subject shall have the right not to be subject to a decision based solely on automated processing. And that includes, and the GDPR highlights this, foremost profiling. But then in general, all of this automated processing, which produces legal effects concerning him or her, or similarly significantly affects him or her. And so what we see from this provision is that basically using automated processing, which results in a legally affecting decision, is prohibited when there is no human intervention. Relevant is in this regard that a person can influence the decision. And it will not be sufficient if a machine basically gives you an output and the human says it's okay without substantially dealing with this. So they say it's a more than only insignificant, typically regular human intervention into the decision process that is necessary. And this needs to go beyond a purely formal confirmation of the computer technically determined result. But of course, as the whole concept of the GDPR is, there is a general prohibition of processing and also automated processing, but this general prohibition is subject to exceptions. And so there are many exceptions in Article 22. If you find in A, if it is necessary for entering into or the performance of a contract, then it's authorized by member state law, or it's based on the subject's explicit consent. And one example of this would be if you go to a bank and you ask for a loan, then they might you might sign something, and then the computer would basically decide if you are available or you have enough capital that they give you this. So that's one example of an automated decision making where the computer would process all of your monetary data and then decides, but only because you before that explicitly consented to this. In any event, if you do use one of these exceptions, you have to implement suitable measures to safeguard the data subject's rights and freedoms. And in general, we see when we use data in scientific research, which the GDPR explicitly wants, that suitable measures and safeguards need to be implemented. In general, you will find this provision in Article 89. And that's also one of the strenuous tasks from a legal point of view, because it's so broad, the concept of suitable measures. And that's especially difficult when technicians, and we have a lot of those in the virtual brain cloud, try to set up the cloud with appropriate measures, but then concretizing specific technical measures from an abstract legal provision is quite a hard task. And it's like, as I highlighted before with the brain images, that this requires intense, actually interdisciplinary working. Now, as Angela pointed out in her introduction, the project processes a lot of sensitive data. And the question now is, if AI and then automated decision-making would make use of special categories of data, would these be possible under Article 22? And so again, special categories of data are health data, genetic data, biometric data. So, and if we look at Article 22(4), decisions referred to in paragraph 2 shall, and that's this one here. So those are the exceptions to the prohibition. So if decisions on that basis shall not be based on special categories of personal data referred to in Article 9(1), this is the one that's describing what these are. They should not be based unless point A or G of Article 9(2) applies. And that's a little difficult, I see that. But if you look below, you see that 9(2)A says that the data subject has given explicit consent to the processing of those personal data. Or if you look at Article 9(2)G, then it says processing is necessary for reasons of substantial public interest. So those are the two exceptions that the GDPR mentions, where automated decision-making could be made use of when you deal with sensitive data like health data, genetic and biomedical data. But we see that these two exceptions do not mention research exception, because for general processing without the automated part, you could use special categories of data, again, if you set up the right security measures, but for scientific research purposes. But as the GDPR here does not mention research as an explicit exception to that, I would say that it's rather limited and probably not possible to process these data automatically, like an automatic decision making. And finally, another point for all of that is, and that's interesting, I think, for a research project when they start developing it, is that when you use automated decision making, then you have to comply, of course, also with the information duties. So whenever data is being processed, the data subject has the right to be informed. And the information, when it comes to Article 22, which is the automated decision making, it says that the data subject should be informed about, in a meaningful information about the logic involved, as well as the significance and the envisaged consequences of such processing for the data subject. And usually the information needs to be adapted to the target group. So if we say that this is used for patients that might be, in a way impaired for whatever reason, or you're involving children, then you need to explain this logic appropriately. And so that's, I think, one of the very difficult things to explain somewhat very complex technical processing to laymen and then even in their level. But this is very important because that's one of the fundamental principles of the GDPR, namely the transparency principle. What we found out as doing our research is that as sometimes data becomes part of algorithms themselves, the whole system gets more and more complex, and it's what Forcia said leads to a black box phenomenon. And this is the case when basically you don't really, you cannot share what the AI is doing. And so in turn, that promotes explainable AI, which is a term that's been created for artificial intelligence to be better explained to the users and to the people that are affected. And in the interest of time, I'm concluding now that AI-driven research requires, as any research that's containing personal data, general data protection analysis, assessment, and then compliance. We have to classify the personal data and establish the sharing structure. We have to make sure who is responsible for the use of AI, as we cannot allocate responsibility to AI from a legal perspective, at least at the moment. We have the accountability principle that requires a controller to make sure all of the fundamental principles of the GDPR are complied with. If we involve AI in such a research project, we need to analyze if there is automated decision-making and the consequences. And then we should also try to make the use of this decision-making transparent, or in general, any use of personal data as transparent as possible. Thank you. And I hand back to Angela.
Great. Many thanks, Michael, for guiding us down the rabbit warren that is the GDPR and in its role in protecting our rights to privacy and to confidentiality. So in the interest of time, we'll take questions right at the end. So coming up next, I'm going to introduce Dr. Richard Milne. He's a senior scientist at the Wellcome Genome campus in the Society and Ethics Research Group. And his research here focuses mainly on social and ethical questions relating to the development of new technologies. He will be presenting via a video, so I'll ask the Zoom moderator to cue that up. And after this, as I said, we'll pass on to questions for all the speakers together. over to you, Richard/LOE moderator. Maybe while we wait for the video to be queued up, I think I see Richard in the room and Bernd and Michael. I did have a general question that occurred to me as I was listening to Michael's presentation, and this was around consent. So I think everyone would agree that AI is a complicated topic, and it's hard to explain, especially in a lay way. Is there a general feeling that the current consent mechanisms for the use of data for AI are fit for purpose, or do we need to think about developing new consent mechanisms? Michael, do you want to perhaps start?
Yeah, maybe, since the GDPR follows a concept that's called informed consent. I would say that when you use AI and the subject is not appropriately more or less informed, then the consent is invalid. So I would say that because of that principle, I think the law is sufficient enough in this regard, yes.
Muted. Yeah, hold that thought and we'll maybe come back to that later on. Let's see if this video works.
Hi, I'm Richard MILNE. I'm a social scientist based in the Society and Ethics Research Group at the Wellcome Genome campus in Cambridge, where I work on social and ethical questions associated with new medical technologies, particularly data-driven technologies applied in the context of genomics and dementia research. And I'm presenting on behalf also of my colleague, Alessia Costa. So in this paper, we consider ethical questions raised by AI and data-driven technologies for the detection of cognitive decline. And we're drawing on three sources to discuss these questions. The first is the literature around the ethics of dementia research and care, particularly focused on early detection and risk profiling. The second is a parallel literature on data and algorithmic ethics in medicine. And the third is interviews with domain experts that have been conducted as part of an ongoing research study. And together, the aim is that these materials contribute to mapping what Luciano Floridi and Maria Rosio Tadeo describe as the geometry of data ethics in the context of early detection of Alzheimer's or dementia. What we do in the paper is focus on two specific areas, and our aim is to show how emerging ethical considerations are both familiar from previous research in Alzheimer's disease and dementia, but also how they present new or novel inflections or extensions of these existing concerns. So, focusing on two specific areas, our aim is to show how emerging ethical concerns are familiar from previous research in Alzheimer's disease and dementia, but also how they're new. So the first area we discuss relates to the return of risk information and the responsibilities associated with this. The second, which has perhaps received less attention in terms of dementia research, but is a significant area of focus in wider debates, is that of algorithmic bias and health equity. And although we're highlighting these two domains, our aim is not to suggest that they're the only areas of that are worthy of deeper consideration. Previous work's drawn attention to questions of consent, the challenges of sharing clinical and research data, and issues of data governance. And an area of importance that we don't discuss in detail is the challenge of balancing the wide collection and use of clinical and research data in the pursuit of social or individual benefits, with, on the other hand, respecting people's privacy by ensuring that data collection is transparent and that people are protected, that people's data and the inferences about them are protected. So this balance is central to establishing trust in the actors associated with collecting data, not least in a context such as dementia and Alzheimer's disease, in which they remain associated with significant stigma and discrimination, and stigma which it's been suggested may extend to the domain of early detection as well. So our discussion, as I mentioned, forms part of an ongoing research study to identify emerging ethical issues associated with digital tools for the early diagnosis of dementia. This project is an empirical ethics study, so it involves interviews with researchers, clinicians, and companies working in this area about the ethical issues they're encountering and considering in their work and what they're doing about them. And interviews with older adults about, as members of the general public, about the social and ethical questions that they associate with the adoption of digital health technologies. To date, I'm going to be drawing on 25 expert interviews that have been conducted with participants from academia, from clinical medicine, data science, and within the management of digital health companies that are operating in this area. And this study is called SPACE, and it's funded by the Wellcome Trust as a seed award in society and ethics. So core areas of application of AI techniques, such as machine learning in the context of dementia draw on data from neuroimaging, genomics, electronic health records, and a range of digital devices. And these forms of data are collected across a spectrum, from information derived almost exclusively in clinical or medical research contexts like imaging, through those which may be derived from either consumer-facing activities or commercial, as part of commercial practices. And in our work, we're really interested in the right-hand side of this spectrum, so tools which are potentially applicable in non-clinical as well as clinical settings with or without the involvement of clinicians. And these include things like digital cognitive testing and the use of devices and sensors. So 3 distinct areas of application can be identified within this work. And they're united by their reliance on kind of large-scale processing of data that's qualitatively different potentially to that of clinically derived information as measures of real-world activity. So the first involves the digital implementation of assessment techniques that are similar in approach, if not necessarily in content or form, to paper-based assessments of cognition and behavior. So this might include cognitive assessments that make use of the visual or media capabilities of smartphones or tablets. The second relates to tools which are assessments of cognition or behavior that are actively performed by an individual alone or in a clinical context, but that differ from a kind of classic model of a cognitive test. So they might include assessments of gait or voice. And the final group of applications, which in general are probably at an earlier stage of development, extend the second group to aim at the passive or what patent applications and company websites often describe as unobtrusive or non-intrusive assessments of cognitive status. So this might include ongoing monitoring of smartphone or computer use, following navigation patterns, or even in-home mobility. And this is something that a number of developers that we spoke to described as kind of a future potential of technology in this area. But perhaps the most striking example is provided in the patent application for the Google Home device. And because it's a patent, it may be a future application that's never implemented or that's not planned to be implemented, but it gives an insight into how such technologies might be thought of being used. So the Google Home patent describes a system that may monitor household occupants' movement patterns and compare these with those associated with Alzheimer's disease. And that the system may therefore infer a higher probability that the household occupant has the disease, and that this inference may then be reported, although it doesn't make clear to whom, and or recorded for subsequent use. And this passive, unobtrusive model of detecting cognitive decline follows on from discussions of the value of internet-enabled smart homes that particularly emerged in the late 1990s and early 2000s within initiatives such as Intel's proactive computing program. So together, these 3 areas, these 3 domains of application form part of a picture of the digital detection of cognitive decline. And the main area in which they're being applied at the moment is currently in clinical research, either on their own to validate their ability to detect or predict cognitive change, or to assess their potential as clinical trial outcome measures. In the future, the aim is that these technologies may be applied in the clinic, or in care as part of ongoing cognitive assessments, but also potentially in insurance and consumer markets. So the digital health company NeuroTrack, for example, have partnerships with insurance companies in Japan and the USA in order to help provide preventive brain health programs. And the consumer well-being market is being targeted as a longer-term program by some of the developers that we spoke to. Okay, so moving on to consider the specific kind of ethical domains associated with these technologies. The first context that we address is that of the return of results and communication of risk. And here the challenge is to achieve a balance between recognizing the right to know, providing helpful information, and protecting from potential harms. And this is a discussion that, as I'm sure many of you watching are aware, has pervaded the field of dementia prevention research since the early 1990s in the identification of the ApoE4 allele. So in the work of people like Stephen Post here. And it's been perpetuated by 3 decades of research on genetics, imaging, fluid biomarkers, through which the ability to predict an individual's risk and detect early signs of disease has continued to progress at pace, but with persistent uncertainties about the implications for any single individual. But also, whilst the ability to intervene to reduce or modify an individual's risk has lagged behind. And this raises these repeated questions that come up in places like the New York Times, where this quotes from, or in the marketing of tests from companies like 23andMe about the value of knowing this information. And at the heart of this discussion lies the question of an individual's rights to know and not to know information about their health. And these rights have been emphasized and clarified in the context of genetic testing, but they might become particularly acute in the context of digital tools, where the expectation of access to data and its processing may be greater. And as these discussions have also shown, it's important to consider not just the right to know, but also what one's able to know. So the accuracy and the validity of the information that one receives, and the potential benefits and harms associated with learning this information. So given this context and history, it's clear that questions of disclosure and risk communication are not unique to algorithmic approaches to cognitive assessments. Tools for digital detection do, though, raise distinctive and novel challenges, as medical information or information which may have a medical relevance escapes the clinic and is circulated, accessed, and assessed across multiple different sites, including clinics and homes, but also in the offices of insurance companies, potentially employment applications. And questions about what information to feed back to users and how to do that were repeatedly raised as a concern by the academic and company researchers we interviewed. So for many working in this area, providing users with a digital assessment of their cognitive health and their risk of cognitive decline is an essential part of a program of not only detecting, but also reducing the risk of dementia, particularly by encouraging behavior change. So as one researcher described to us, it's a very comfortable way of learning about your health. But as another commented, such information is two-edged. So if you just give someone a score, they said to us, I mean, you can't tell someone on an app that they have Alzheimer's or that they're going to get Alzheimer's disease because it's ethically questionable. And the concern that they're articulating here echoes these deliberations in the bioethics, clinical, and popular literature around Alzheimer's disease. And it relates to the potential harms associated with learning one's risk of dementia and the need for such information, if it is to be delivered appropriately. And as another researcher then pointed out, such concerns are particularly acute in the context of dementia. You know, as he said to us, those questions around why would you want to know early, what level of accuracy, and how difficult is it to do that? Those are bigger and different questions for dementia, and that's recognised in 20 years of studies around genetics and more recently around amyloid biomarkers on the impact of learning risk information. So in response, researchers described the importance of understanding a person's condition in context, as another clinical researcher put it, as part of a whole picture, saying that it's always good to have a professional looking at you to determine whether the whole picture of you is potentially showing the first signs of a disease. And the kind of the holistic commitment that this researcher makes in this quote highlights the kind of challenges and the potential redistribution of responsibilities associated with digitized early detection and its relationship with diagnosis. And those terms around early detection and early diagnosis are often blurred. But the distinctions between them become increasingly important as clinical approaches to disease shift away from overt symptomatology. In the case of AI or data-driven tools, this move presents 3 questions around the ability of clinicians to explain to patients, but also to themselves, how an assessment has been reached, and to raise questions about its appropriateness or accuracy. Relatedly, around the accountability for decisions made on the basis of these assessments, if their functioning is not completely transparent. And finally, about how the use of such tools in the clinic may both redistribute responsibility and potentially in some ways diminish it. So as Jess Morley and colleagues put it in a recent commentary around ethics of AI in health, algorithmic decision-making can create a misleading sense of certainty, this kind of idea of algorithmic power. And that in the process, what it can do is to make diagnosis seem like a straightforward activity of identifying symptoms and then fitting them into textbook categories. And particularly in the area of dementia, this contrasts with what we know from studies of diagnostic practice, which emphasize contingency, contestation around diagnostic assessments, and processes of negotiation between doctors, patients, and families. And that this shows the kind of complexity of arriving at what another interview described as ultimately a clear and sophisticated clinical diagnosis. So the ostensible simplification of diagnosis through detection may potentially, within this negotiation, within these interactive contexts, limit the autonomy and and by inference the responsibility of both clinicians and patients. And together, these challenges create the danger that while the potential value of tools for early detection may partly lie in their ability to empower users, as another clinical researcher worried, you get into hotter and hotter water the more responsibility within this process you take away from the clinician. So the second area of consideration that we want to highlight has become particularly prominent in wider discussions around the application of algorithms in society and in healthcare, around questions of health inequalities, social justice, and algorithmic bias. So where discussion of the ethics of disclosure and early detection, as it's articulated in the scientific, clinical, and bioethics literature, often relies on a focus on clinical ethics, particularly autonomy, non-maleficence, and beneficence. Attention to social justice and equity considerations draws more closely on a framework of public health ethics. And because of that, it kind of emphasizes the impact of algorithmic assessments, not just on individuals and their psychosocial lives, but also on groups and populations, and the potential creation of unjust differences between these groups. So the development of digital tools for the detection of cognitive decline has significant potential in terms of expanding access to healthcare and cognitive assessment. And that's particularly the case, I think, as we're seeing at the moment in the COVID situation, where there's a kind of growing discussion around remote clinical assessments as research and routine care are complicated by the difficulty of accessing patient populations. However, it's also important to remember that the development of digital technologies has been associated with a dramatic increase in global and national inequalities. And in the AI ethics literature, for example, in the work that I've highlighted here of Virginia Eubanks on the US social security system, it's become increasingly common to see examples of how the applications of algorithms can reproduce or exacerbate social and economic inequalities. In the case of medicine, biases and deficiencies in the data used by machine learning algorithms may contribute to health disparities that reproduce socioeconomic inequalities, for example, by redistributing resources or by failing to benefit people who aren't represented in the data set. So this might arise because certain populations are missing or underrepresented, or because of differences in data collection or classification practices across data sets. In the case of genetics, for example, the predictive ability of polygenic risk scores for common diseases, which is an area of interest for dementia research as well, has been shown to vary widely across ethnic groups as they're developed on the basis of data sets predominantly drawn from North America and Northern Europe. In the field of ophthalmology, which is another area of potential interest in terms of retinal imaging for the as a data set for machine learning in the early detection of neurodegeneration, a recent review found that publicly available imaging data sets are geographically concentrated as well, and they're not available at all for 45% of the global population. And that this jeopardizes the ability of inferences made upon this data to generalize across populations. So such considerations are becoming increasingly prominent in wider debate, but they were rarely raised in our interviews. And I think this was interesting. And one interviewee did describe their concern that because of these biases, because of the potential biases in the data, that they were concerned that you might end up saying that they developed a racist algorithm. And this interview points out that there are persistent inequalities in access to dementia care and the representation of different populations in research, and that this may impact the conclusions and applicability of research. So in the case of dementia diagnosis, access to memory clinics and even dementia services is unequally distributed. In the UK and the USA, lower access to a diagnosis has been shown to be associated with older age, male gender, and is affected by levels of education and income. Those from less deprived socioeconomic groups, so among the wealthier, are more likely to be initiated onto anti-dementia drugs than those in the most deprived economic groups. And that these less deprived groups may also present at clinic earlier in the presentation of symptoms. In the USA, those from Hispanic populations have been reported to be less likely to have received a diagnosis and to access diagnostic services at an early stage. And similar findings have been found in the UK for Asian men, women, and Black men. And this unevenness in clinical and research settings has consequences for the clinical and research data sets that are generated by people's use of and access to services. So, for example, this unevenness in the data and the research, and health records that may ultimately form the ground truth for the kind of training and development of AI tools has potential consequences for the transferability of these tools across contexts. So some traditional cognitive screening tools informed by European or North American data aren't validated in and may have limited applicability to low and middle income settings, raising the possibility that there may be education, literacy, or cultural biases in terms of the results they report. In the case of genomic or imaging data, predictive models are potentially affected by the reliance of the field on a small number of non-diverse data sources. So, for example, the dominance of the ADNI data set in imaging. In the case of digital tools specifically, models that rely on the processing of digital and sensor data are potentially affected by the persistence of a digital divide, so both within countries and across national, cultural, and economic context. So in the UK, although this divide has been narrowing over the last 20 years, it's still unevenly distributed, both by age and geography. So people who are older and who live in more deprived areas are still less likely to have access to or adopt digital tools. And consequently, they're also less likely to generate data of the type that might be used to train the algorithms that are then applied to their healthcare. So in the last 20 minutes, what I've given is by no means a comprehensive overview of the ethical issues associated with the development of new tools for cognitive assessment that draw on AI techniques and big data. But the key point that we hope to have drawn out is that the pertinent ethical questions in many ways predate the development of digital and AI technologies, and they persist as challenges to be faced in their future, albeit potentially in new ways and with new inflections. For researchers and companies in this area, we kind of tentatively suggest that engaging with these challenges involves 5 elements, which fortuitously form the acronym CHESS. So the first is clarity about what information to return to people, how and when, and what this information means, and particularly in a digital context where people may have differing expectations related to access to data about them. Resolving this tension also means clarifying the relationship between better detection and diagnosis, and how better detection can lead to better care and quality of life. And in order to understand this better, we need continued work with older adults with and without dementia to understand and map relevant outcomes. The second element is humility. There's a need for humility amid the hype about AI and new tools for early detection, to understand their place within a complex social and technical process of diagnosis, and in order to protect and promote the autonomy of both patients and doctors. In terms of equity, there's a need for a focus on equitable access to ensure that new technologies benefit those who are most in need rather than those who necessarily already have the most. And this includes attention to inequalities in data and the potential for algorithmic approaches to exacerbate inequalities in access and care. Suitability means recognizing that technology may not always be the most appropriate. most appropriate way forwards, and that while action may be needed to support older adults in using technology, other avenues of access to care must be protected. And finally, support. So where it is appropriate and can benefit patients in line with their expectations of what would be what are valuable outcomes, then older adults and those who are particularly that group of the population who might be described as digitally withdrawn should be supported to access care. So thank you very much for your time, and I look forward to answering any questions. So thanks. Bye.
Great. So thank you very much, Richard, for a really eloquent presentation. And I really like the way that final CHESS acronym accurately captures a lot of the limitations and ethical considerations of algorithmic decision-making tools. Because we only have about 4 or 5 minutes really for questions, I thought I'd address a general question to the whole panel. So one word that kept on coming back throughout all your presentations was the concept of responsibility and the allocation of responsibility. And this is a particularly challenging area when it comes to early diagnosis of dementia, especially when using data-driven tools. Do we need better review mechanisms? I mean, how can we best address this allocation of responsibility question? Is it through better review mechanisms, for example, ethical review boards, or do we need guidance at the level of data protection, or is it something else entirely? If I could maybe ask Bernd to answer first, given that his presentation was first.
Okay. So, I mean, I don't have a ready-made answer for this. I think the question of responsibility needs to be looked at different levels. So we already have existing responsibilities that are well established and well played out. And I think the interesting question is, how can we move from what's already there to the new complexities that new types of digital technologies raise? And for me, this is not so much a question of responsibility, but I would call it a meta responsibility, so a higher level responsibility. So how do we make sure that existing responsibilities actually work in the way that they're intended and that they have outcomes that are desirable? So I don't think we need to get rid of ethics review or any of the processes we have at the moment, but what we need to do is have a well-organized discussion around how they fit together and how we make sure that the technologies actually lead to what we collectively as a society, but also as patients, want them to lead to. That's a very procedural and abstract answer, but that's, I guess, the best I can come up with.
Yeah, no, it's an excellent answer. Richard, do you have any thoughts?
Yeah, I would agree with Bernd about the kind of that overarching meta responsibility, and I would also, I suppose, add as well the question of whose responsibility are we talking about? I mean, so one of the features of the digital technologies that I was talking about is the idea that in some ways they place new responsibilities upon people to act on the basis of their risk, and you have this kind of responsibilization of people, people in those early detection stages. And the question is, like, what kinds of responsibilities do we expect people to be taking on, and how comfortable are we giving those kind of distributing those responsibilities? And then I think as well there's the question of what responsibilities do we add to or take away from kind of clinical work as well, in terms of the kind of processing, large-scale processing of data. I mean, there's this question of how much responsibility does a clinician then have within that system if some of the processing and the analysis of somebody's cognitive state or their biology is done in a way that's not scrutable by them, and then overarching kind of systems in terms of the responsibilities of companies for kind of responsible use of data and responsible development of and marketing of products, and then of researchers as well in that domain. So I think there's a kind of I would just add that whose responsibility are we
Yeah, so I think that's a really good point to finish on. So there are multiple overlapping responsible actors. So it's a responsibility that needs to be shared. There's no easy answers to the question. So we have to make sure that we have actors in place to govern all the different aspects of the pathways involved in making decisions about health using algorithms and AI. And I suppose a lot of that is to come, but I think with projects like the Virtual Brain Cloud, with people like yourselves, with the Human Brain Project, and some of these other projects that have really embedded ethics at their heart, I think we're in a good position to really come up with some realistic solutions to address some of the key challenges. With that, I think I'm going to have to close the session. So apologies if anyone had any burning questions they would like to ask. I would encourage you to use the networking tools that are available through the platform. So you can contact Richard, Michael and Bernd directly by messaging them on the platform. Apologies for potentially opening the floodgates to you all. And I'd also encourage you to visit the Virtual BrainCloud booth if you'd like to learn more about the project. Thank you all for your attendance, and we look forward to another half day of excitement at the conference. Thank you, everyone, and goodbye.
Thanks, Angela.
Thank you. Bye.